Good morning. Firstly, I want to dedicate this morning's learning for the Refuah Shalema, the speedy recovery of Sarah Shira Chana Bat Yonit and Isser Asher Ben Shterna Miriam. Should have a speedy and immediate and miraculous, full, complete recovery. Right. So that's the first thing I want to do. Okay, now secondly, today is my audio working? It is there. Today is the 20th of Teves, which is the Yartzeit, the anniversary of the passing of the great Maimonides, the great Rambam. The epitaph, I think that's the word, on his tombstone. Not really sure who wrote it, but the epitaph there states, Moshe ad Moshe lekam Moshe. From Moses onto Moses, there is none like Moses. And it's referring to Moshe Rabbeinu, original Moses, and Rambam, whose name was Moshe, right? Rambam stands for Rabbeinu Moshe ben Maimon, our teacher Moshe, son of Maimon, and thus Maimonides, son of Maimon. So just a word about Rambam, and one of the ways in which you can explain that statement, that from Moshe to Moshe, there was none like Moshe. Today we would even think about it as a controversy, but at the time, this was a big controversy. And Rambam made this really his life mission in many ways, certainly his writings. And that is, he pioneered the idea of opening up Torah to the masses. Until Rambam came along, for the most part, Torah was relegated to those who were scholarly enough and educated enough to be able to traverse the complex seas of the Talmud. That's what it came down to. So if you knew how to read, perhaps not how to translate, so maybe you knew a little bit of, maybe you knew how to read a little Chumash. And if you're a little more advanced, then you had a copy of Rashi's text to get a little more insight. But that probably was the limit, assuming you know how to read and translate in Hebrew. But certainly the complexities of Torah, Jewish law, and even Jewish philosophy was very much not available to the masses, and Rambam pioneered and broke through that barrier, which today seems so obvious. Of course, you make Torah popularized for the masses, but that wasn't the case. And Rambam's three major works all did this. In fact, with the exception of Rambam's book of law, which I'll get to in a minute, all of his works were written in Arabic. In Arabic, because that was the language of the local people. That was the language of the masses. And that itself removed a barrier to entry, a language barrier. And starting with his first work, his commentary on the Mishnah. His commentary on the Mishnah is, the objective is that for a student who can read and translate the Mishnah, because it's rather simple on face value, but cannot go through the Talmud, which explains the back and forth and the ins and outs of the Mishnah. That's too complex. So this person who's basically at the level of reading and translating the Mishnah doesn't really understand the Mishnah because he doesn't know the Gemara's background. So he took the Gemara, simplified it, condensed it, and turned it into a running Arabic commentary on the Mishnah. So that anybody can pick up the Gemara, pick up the Mishnah, read his commentary, and get full background. And he did this, to the best of my knowledge, before he was even 25. For context, just to give you an idea of talking about the level of the person's mind, he's thrown out of Spain with his family because of the Mujahideen, the radical Muslims at the time. Although, generally speaking, the Muslims in Spain were nice to the Jews. He happened to have lived during a time of punctuation when the Muslims were not so nice to the Jews, and they were thrown out. So while he's running away, I guess with his family and probably more community members, his father was the Dayan in Cordova. And throughout this insane travels, he meets a doctor who teaches him how to be a doctor and writes this book. commentary on the Mishnah while he's busy running away, not sitting in a library in the comforts of Hampstead with air conditioning. That wasn't his conditions for writing a monumental commentary on the Mishnah that condenses all of Talmud in simplified Arabic. And likewise, his Moed Nevuchim, his Guide to the Perplexed, you can make the case that it's the first work of Kiruv, outreach. You read his introduction to that book. The perplexed that he's addressing is not merely someone who doesn't know anything. Quite the contrary, he's speaking to someone who's very well educated in Greek philosophy, which is popular at the time. Right, while their Christian neighbors in Europe were going through dark ages, our Muslim friends down in the Arab lands were going through a golden age, actually. And they were very much embraced Greek philosophy. So right, they popularized during this time Aristotelian and Platonic and Socratic thinking. And Rambam is addressing someone, he names a person, someone who is well versed in Greek philosophy and is perplexed by how to settle all this logic and reasoning with Torah faith. And that's the objective of the book, again, written in Arabic. So he's addressing these two works, really addressing crowds that are not properly initiated in Torah study, either because they're not in the level of scholarship that they can access Gemara, and thus he simplifies it for them in his commentary to the Mishnah, or because they are actually educated, but educated in secular philosophy. So he makes a book to address that. And this became like a cornerstone as the golden age of Spain expanded and secular studies became more and more popular. So it's a big struggle the Jews went through the time. There's a famous response from the Rashba in which he describes trying to implement, or where he writes he's trying to implement like rules as to what age you can start learning Greek philosophy and what you have to know before, because it was a concern. And Rambam's book of Guide to the Perplexed, controversial as it was, served as a cornerstone for those engaged in this kind of perplexity. How do I settle rationalist Greek philosophy and Torah faith? Right, which explains why Rambam's view of Torah, to begin with, is very rationalistic, certainly in the book of Moed Nevuchim. But we've discussed it before, we're not going to discuss that now. But it was controversial as well. In fact, he writes in his introduction, I know some of you are going to read this and you're going to think I'm a heretic, or you might misunderstand it and think heresy, but I feel it's necessary to explain this for those who are smart enough to understand, considering their education in Greek philosophy. And he does, he addresses Aristotle, he quotes Aristotle and says, here's where he went wrong, here's where he went right, here's why, and so on and so forth. And then finally, his book of Jewish law, his monumental magnum opus. The book is 14-volume book of law, the one and only book to go through every single subject of Jewish law. There is no other book like it, not the Mishnah. The Mishnah doesn't include Hanukkah, for example. The Gemara doesn't include many laws relating to the Holy Land, considering that it was written in Babel. The Code of Jewish Law certainly only talks about laws relating to how a Jew has to behave today. No laws of temple, for example, in the Code of Jewish Law. Rambam's book of Jewish Law is the first book to codify every area of Jewish life, including theological, which is another area in which he pioneered. Halachic theology. What's the Jewish law? What's law of what a Jew has to believe? As opposed to here's how you behave, and then philosophy is a separate entity. That's the way it was. And Rambam codified all of Jewish life, including Jewish theology. Here's how we define God. Here's how we understand it. Here's how we define Mashiach. Here's how we understand it. Here's how we define the soul, free choice, determinism, all of that stuff. Codified in this code of law. And he writes in his introduction, I'm writing this in such a fashion that all a person has to do is read the Chumash, the written Torah, then read my book, because this book covers all of the oral Torah, and that's it, you know all of Torah. And I'm writing it in such a way that it's simplified so that kakoten kagadol, whether the person is, quote, small or big, whatever level of education, read this, it's simplified, it's in point form, no back and forth, no complexities of Talmudic arguments, simplified, point. He didn't even put sources for where he got his laws, which he actually expressed regret for later. Is that it became controversial. Like, okay, you come to this law, but I read the Talmud differently, is what other scholars argued. And the main point I'm trying to make is that Rambam pioneered this idea of making Torah available to everybody, and this is itself controversial. You're ruining Torah, is what they told him. You're simplifying it. It's meant to be complex. It's meant to be deep. What happens if someone misunderstands it? And Rambam argued, no, Torah is the nachlas haklal. It's the inheritance of the populace, and every Jew deserves access to Torah, all of it. Unless he simplified the Gemara, simplified Jewish law, simplified Jewish philosophy, or at least made it available to anyone who wants to read it. So today in his Yartzeit, all of us here are really the beneficiaries of his work, because it became standardized. And over time, actually posthumously, the controversy of his works lasted for quite a long time after his lifetime. But over time, obviously, everyone's come around to see the value, and not just the value, the necessity, almost the urgency of making Torah popularized for and available to everybody, especially in today's day. So we're really the beneficiaries of his pioneering work.
We have a similar thing going on with the Zohar today. There are people who are trying to popularize it.
Yeah.
Without any really deep understanding of predecessors. By just reading the Zohar, you can learn Kabbalah.
Yeah.
But
there is, yeah. Certainly, Chassidus is a big part of that, making Zohar palpable to the human mind. There have been some efforts like that to. There's yet to emerge an authoritative, even translation of the Zohar. Meaning it's in Aramaic, and the Aramaic is more complex than Talmudic Aramaic in many ways, in many respects, and it requires quite a bit of anthropomorphism, right, to extract the meaning from their plain translation. So I don't know that there is like a authoritative translation of Zohar yet. I don't know, but it's certainly the direction we're going. And moreover, as the fifth Chabad Rebbe would quote, "Bahai chiburo dilach," in the opening of the with this work of yours meaning Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, this work of yours, the Zohar, Yifrikun Minei Berachmin. I think that's the language. Jews will be redeemed mercifully. And then the Alter Rebbe famously wrote many years later, mitzvah lagales Arizal, and mitzvah lagales Zaysa. It's now become a mitzvah to popularize these teachings. So certainly in the last couple of generations, there's been a strong push to make esoteric teachings, which have otherwise been locked behind scholarly barrier for entry, is now coming down. That's definitely the case. Yeah. There's a lot more to be said on that, but that's 100% true, and this is the direction we're going.
This commentary.
Sorry?
Rambam's commentary from the Mishnah.
Yeah.
Has that been popularized?
Sure. It's available, absolutely. What's most famous actually is his introduction. There's actually a few parts that are famous.
Oh, right.
There's his introduction to the Mishnah is very famous. His famous introduction where he explains how the oral tradition works.
Uh-huh.
That's his introduction to his commentary on the Mishnah, which is really an introduction to all of Talmud. Another popular segment is his introduction to tractate, the last chapter of tractate Sanhedrin. We discusses Mashiach. That's the tractate we learned a while back, Sanhedrin.
Yeah.
And his 13 principles of faith are listed in his commentary to the Mishnah. So there are quite a few sections that are popular, but his commentary as a whole is popular. It's widely read. I mean, anyone who's learning Mishnah and wants to know what's going on will have to read Rambam along with, the classic is Rambam and a Bartanura, Vaji Bartanura. Vaji Bartanura is much more simplified. It's more like a Rashi rather than like but Rambam's an easy read. It's not like a difficult read. I believe it's even available in English.
it's a volume set, I would imagine.
I think
It's,
sorry?
it's a volume.
Yeah, it's a
set.
running commentary on the whole Mishnah. It's going to be volume. It's going to be
Right.
voluminous.
Right.
I believe it. I want it. Yeah, here. I believe his translation. I don't. You know what? Maybe not. I don't know. Check Sefaria. The website Sefaria. They may have a translation of the Rambam's commentary on the Mishnah, but it's an easy read. It's not a complex read. It flows.
I know that Art Scroll has Mishnah sets, and one set has the commentary of the Bartanura.
Right. So Bartanura is like Rashi for the Mishnah. It's like Rashi for the Mishnah, just to get the plain meaning of what's going on. Rambam gives more background,
More depth.
but he does so in a lucid fashion. So
Sounds.
yeah, he got rid of, so to speak, he repackaged the complexities of Talmudic language into such a way that it's lucid.
Seems like a nice companion to studying the Talmud.
Very much so. Very much. Studying the Mishnah, and that's what it meant. That's what it was meant to be. Yep. Okay. Having said that, let's get to the Gemara. We are Memhei with Aleph 45a. And if you go to the narrow set of lines, you count up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The last words in that line is Omar Le Abaye. That's where we're at. So where are we? The Gemara introduced a text which stated that Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov was of the view that in addition to Sanhedrin being dispatched to measure the distance between the corpse, the unresolved murder, and the nearest city, Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov argued that the king and the high priest must go as well. That was the text. Now the Gemara records a conversation that takes place in the study house in which someone poses the following inquiry. When Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov says that Sanhedrin should go out, is that him saying the entire Sanhedrin should go out to measure? Or is that him saying, look, I have no opinion on Sanhedrin, see Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon about how many members of the Sanhedrin should go, either 3 or 5? Mm-hmm. Or is Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov's statement that Sanhedrin goes out, he means literally the entire Sanhedrin. This was the inquiry posed in the study hall. So Rabbi Yosef tells everybody to listen to a text. And in this text, we have a scenario in which the Sanhedrin finds a rebellious elder guilty of being a rebellious elder, but they do so outside of their chambers. Mm-hmm. And that text says that this ruling that he is a rebellious elder does not apply to him because it was done outside the chambers, and the verse says, Valisa la makam, you have to go to the place. So geographically, the Sanhedrin must be located in their chambers in order to establish and rule that one is a rebellious elder. And yet this text describes that they did it outside. And the question now becomes, Rabbi Yosef is telling the crowd, why would the high court, the Sanhedrin, be outside of their chambers? The law is there must be at least 23 members of the chamber, 23 members of the Sanhedrin in the chamber at all times. So why would they be outside? It must be they left for a mitzvah. And which mitzvah would they be leaving for? It must be they left for Egla Arufa. They must have left to go measure unresolved murder to the nearest city. And on the way, they found a rebellious elder and ruled that he is wrong. And the law doesn't apply because they're not in their chambers. But at least we now have an explanation as to why they left the chambers to begin with. So this is Rabbi Yosef's way of suggesting that we at least have one view, which is probably Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov, who would say that the entire Sanhedrin has to go for the Egla Arufa. Otherwise, why would they be found outside of the chambers? This is where we left off. So Omar Le Rabbi Abaye. So again, this is the Gemara is recording this conversation in the study hall. So when Rabbi Yosef shares this view, Abaye says to him, Loi, maybe you're misunderstanding here. This is not a conclusive evidence that the Sanhedrin goes out to measure. Because Dilma, perhaps, there's another reason why the Sanhedrin would have left their chambers. Egla Arufa is not the only option. There could have been another reason why they left, namely, Lahaisif Alahir the Al Hazares, in order to expand the borders of the city and the borders of the temple courtyard. This is extremely relevant because there are all kinds of laws specifically pertaining to karbanos, pertaining to offerings, as to where certain offerings must be eaten and where they're allowed to even go. Sometimes they have to be eaten in Jerusalem, and sometimes they have to be eaten in the courtyard of the temple. Now, when the population grows and you need more space, you have to expand the borders of these various different areas, whether the city limits or the Azara, the courtyard. And for that to happen, you need to have all 71 judges. So therefore, Rabbi says, you're citing to a text in which we see that the high court left the chambers. And you're assuming they must have left for the purpose of measuring an Egla Arufa. Says Abaye, not necessarily is that the case. It's possible that this Mishnah, which describes the high court leaving the chambers, is because they want to expand the borders of the city. And that's why they're out of the chambers. And therefore, this is not conclusive that there's any reason for them to leave for Egla Arufa. Because I have another perfectly good reason for why they left the chambers. Kedetnan, as we learned in the Mishnah, continues Abaye, we may not expand the borders of the city, or the chambers of the temple, only if you have the high court of all 71 judges. Now this ends the conversation. Okay, I'll explain in a moment how I know that. Because now the Gemara's narration is going to take a side. Gemara's narration is going to take a side between Abaye and Rabbi Yosef. And if this would be in the same conversation, the Gemara would have introduced it with, so-and-so raised the following point. Because the Gemara is going to cite a Mishnaic text which sides with Rabbi Yosef. And if it was someone in the study all the time who raised that, they would have said, so-and-so found a text which supports Rabbi Yosef's view. But it's not, it's the Gemara's narration, which leads me to believe as follows. I think I mentioned this before, that the Gemara is really a conglomerate of conversations that take place over the span of 300 years or so. Right? So, and it goes through a number of redactions. As conversations get codified, they get analyzed by the various yeshivas. And then when new information and new insight comes in, you have leaders of the generation who redact those conversations into the original text. So over the centuries, the text of Talmud gets bigger and bigger, until finally it's completely ratified by Ravina and Ravashi. At which point the Talmud redaction stops, except for very minor edits that were done even by later generations, by the Rabbanan Savaroi. Sometimes we have little words, like 3-4 words from them. So the way in which this conversation plays out, it seems as follows. You have someone posed a question to the study hall at the time of Abaye and Yosef. They made their cases. That conversation has been recorded. Rav Yosef suggests that 71 elders would have left for Egla Arufa, and that's why they were found outside the chambers, and that's where the Mishnah discusses what they do if they were to find someone guilty of being a rebellious elder. And Abaye counters by saying, well, no, it could be they left because they're trying to expand the city walls, the city limits. Now, once the conversation is settled, sometime later, they're analyzing this text, and the Gemara's narrator, whoever that is, or the redactor at the time, says, we actually found the text that supports Rabbi Yosef. Right? And from the Gemara's flow, it seems like that's the way it is. So the Gemara says like this. Here's the Gemara's language. Tanya, we've learned in a brisa, so there's no author here, it's the Gemara's narrator, so to speak. It says this. Tanya, we learned in a Mishnaic text, kavasei, in accord with Rav Yosef of Rav Yosef. So this is the text that the narrator is citing to support Rav Yosef's view, namely, Matzon Abeis Pagi. If they, the high court, found this elder Beis Pagi, we said earlier, means the broader Jerusalem metropolis outside of the temple walls. So they found this rebellious elder in Beis Pagi in Jerusalem, the Himra Aleyan, and he rebelled against them, and thus they want to declare him as one who is rebellious. Now, this text actually goes on to explain why they were outside of the chambers. Going, for example, Sheyotzu, this Mishnaic text now that we're citing to, actually says why they left. The original one that Rabbi Yosef cited to didn't say why the court left the chambers. And Rabbi Yosef reasoned they must have left for the Egla Arufa. And Abai says, well, maybe they left for a different reason. They went to expand the borders. But this Mishnaic text actually says the reason why they left. Going, for example, Sheyotzu, that they left their chambers, Lemedidas Agola, to measure the Egla Arufa. Or they left to go expand the border of the city, or to extend the limits of the chambers. So here, this text actually describes why they left, and it gives both of their reasons, which means, therefore, there is a view that all 71 elders leave to measure the Egla Arufa, and thus this conclusively supports Rabbi Yosef's view. Now the text continues, perhaps, lest you think that because 71 elders are finding this singular elder as being rebellious, perhaps the rebellion is considered a valid rebellion, and thus the laws of the rebellious elder apply. Talmud Sotah comes the verse and says, the Kamtov Alisa, you have to get up and go to the place. Malama, this teaches us, Shamakim Goyim, the geographic location of the chambers, the Lishkas Agazis, where the high court usually sits, is what's required in order to apply the law of the rebellious elder. The main reason why we're raising this text, again, is to support Rabbi Yosef's view, which means, therefore, now we have three opinions as to how the measuring of the distance between the unresolved murder in the city, as to who has to do that measuring. Opinion one is Rabbi Shimon, which says 3 judges from the high court. That's it. Now Yehuda says 5 judges from the high court.
Isn't it the other way around?
Rabbi Yehuda said 3. I think Rabbi Yehuda said 5. Turn the page back and have a look. I think it's Rabbi Yehuda said 5. Look at the Mishnah. Yeah. Rabbi Yehuda says 5. Yeah. And then finally we have Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, who says everybody goes out to do the measuring. All 71 judges, the king, the high priest. Which is quite. We said yesterday, it's quite the spectacle. So those are our 3 views. Yeah, you want to say something?
Yeah, the king and the priest wasn't really discussed much in terms of.
Other than Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov's view that Sheiftecha, your judges, refers to the 2 of them. Yeah. It doesn't seem like this is the halacha.
Right. So it's interesting that there was no controversy among the
Maybe there was. Maybe there was controversy. I don't know. I wonder how often Egla Arufa even happened.
Right.
I wonder, perhaps as we go through the Gemara later, we'll find some actual cases of Egla Arufa.
Just my point is that it seems that it was more discussing the Sanhedrin in terms of how many numbers,
Right.
and not so much
Because that was a given. That's his view. Actually, one second. Hold on a second.
the
What's the
priest
saying here?
and the king.
Right. Yeah. I wonder if we'll get to. I wonder if later we'll discover the Gemara recording actual cases in which this happened. I mean, how often does it happen?
Yeah.
I hope not that often.
Right.
It's not like completely crazy that in the span of centuries of Jews living in Israel, there was never an unresolved murder. I mean, like, it's not such a. If every time all 71 elders and the king and the high priest to come out, it would be quite something. But what's interesting is that there's no view in the middle. It's like 2 or 3 judges, 3 or 5 judges, or like everybody. There's nowhere like, okay, half, or all of them, but not the king or the judge, or there's no like. It's like extremes. At any rate,
That's not halacha, right? Or
to the best of my knowledge, the halacha does not follow Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. To the best of my knowledge, it follows Rabbi Shimon actually, and it's 3 judges, right? If I'm not mistaken. look at the citation on the side here. Nope, the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda. That's what the citation on the side indicates. There's a on the side, on the margins of the page, you'll see there's three sets of citations, all authored by the same person who authored the Shulchan Gebordim. I can remember his name, but he when the Gemara first started to become printing, as printing became more popular, he put like footnotes for sources to the Gemara, and he put three sets of sources. One is called Meseres Hashas, in which he cites two other areas in the Talmud to discuss the same subject. He wrote Torah, which is he cites the verses that the Gemara. He gives a source for the verses that the Gemara cites. And lastly, Ein Mishpat Ner Mitzvah, which is he cites to the places in Jewish law that you will find a ruling on any given case in the Gemara. So it's a cheat sheet. You want to know how we rule, you just look where that footnote is. So if there's three opinions in the Gemara, which one of those three have that footnote? And then the halacha follows that one. That's how I looked. And you can see this little hay next to Rabbi Yehuda's.
What's the name?
Ein Mishpat Ner Mitzvah. Right? So you could see a little hay next to Rabbi Yehuda's name, next to Rabbi Yehuda's view. So I'm assuming, therefore, the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda. But there's a citation there and it can be looked up. Okay, you can have a wonderful day, and a good Ner Shabbos, and use out the day of Rambam's Yartzeit to strengthen our own study of Rambam, especially as the study of Rambam was set up by the Rabbi, in which there are three tracks for one to learn Rambam, to cover all of Jewish law, as we described earlier. There's a one chapter a day cycle, one chapter of Rambam's laws a day, and one can finish it in the span of about 3 years. There's 3 chapters a day in which a person can finish all of Jewish law in the span of a year. Or there's a Sefer HaMitzvahs, which is another one of the monumental works of Rambam, to list all 613 mitzvahs, describing each one in a paragraph or two. And there's a study cycle to be able to finish that also throughout the year. That study cycle actually parallels the 3 chapters a day. So whichever laws are being studied by those in the 3 chapter day cycle, those in the Sefer Mitzvahs will learn the mitzvahs related to those laws. Those are the three tracks for studying Rambam's monumental works that cover, as described earlier, all of Torah law. Okay, wonderful day, good Ner Shabbos.